Hey, it's Rachel. This episode of Allies at Work is addressing a heavy topic, gender-based violence. While today's guests present their findings from a scholarly and third-person perspective, these stories can be distressing for some. If you'd like, you may skip to the middle of the episode to the positive actions that male allies can take to help prevent gender-based violence. And if you are experiencing abuse in your own life, please call the National Domestic Violence Hotline at 800-799-7233 or text START, S-T-A-R-T, to 88788. Help is available now. I'm Rachel Cottam, and this is the Allies at Work podcast. Here, you'll discover bite-sized tactics that you can start using today to improve gender equity in your workplace, home, and community. In today's episode, you'll hear from Suzie Greco and Sharmin on the topic of gender-based violence. The work of allyship requires us to confront painful truths and increase our awareness of all forms of inequity. Research from the World Health Organization shows that worldwide, 1 in 3 women will be subjected to physical or sexual violence in their lifetime. While this isn't an easy topic to address, it is critical to gender equality. Suzie will share the importance of men and women supporting each other as we confront sexual violence, and she'll emphasize the unique value of female-to-female allyship. Suzie will also unpack the role patriarchal and religious structures can inadvertently play in perpetuating gender-based violence. Sharmin will share how the socialization of boys can empower them to become male allies. Despite over 20 years of entrenchment in this emotionally challenging work, Sharmin offers a voice of hope. At the end of this episode, I'll share an allyship action with you. Today's allyship action: avoid violent language. Here's Suzie.
My name is Suzie Greco. I am a master's student at Harvard Divinity School with a focus on women, gender, sexuality, and religion, and will begin a PhD program in the fall. I am a board member of the Global Collaborative, a survivor-led network of child advocacy organizations committed to ending child sexual abuse. I am also a male allyship and sexism impact team member for Utah State University and the director of Italian Parish Records. My areas of expertise in regards to male allyship fall under gender violence and religion. I will address 2 areas wherein individuals of both genders can mutually support one another within the prevailing patriarchal frameworks that shape our societal landscape in regards to sexual violence perpetrated against women and girls. This will consist of female-to-female alliances, address why male-to-male alliances harm women, and provide some recommendations for change. First, I'd like to turn to Carl Jung, a Swiss psychoanalyst, as narrated in the Red Book. Jung finds himself in a vision discovering the body of a small girl, covered with blood and wounds. At first, he is enraged, and his soul asks why he feels this way, because the reality is that these things happen every day. He replies, but most of the time we don't see them. His soul asks, so knowing that they happen is not enough to enrage you? Jung replies, if I merely have knowledge of something, it's easier and simpler, and the horror is less real if all you have is knowledge. For anyone who has experienced gender-based violence or knows someone who has, this type of first-hand experience will change your life forever. So what I share today is based on the work of Professor Diane Rosenfeld, the founding director of Gender Violence Program and lecturer on law at Harvard Law School, and Dr. Dennis Mukwege, winner of the Nobel Peace Prize in 2018 for his efforts to end sexual violence in the Democratic Republic of Congo, rape capital of the world. So gender violence is deeply entrenched within our religious community and society grounded in patriarchy. Culturally and socially embedded, female sexuality for centuries has been controlled by legal and religious patriarchal systems. Diane Rosenfeld, the most expert leader in gender violence in the United States, believes that harnessing the power of the unique social order that exists for females to protect one another from male aggression can help eliminate sexual coercion and enable more peaceful and cooperative relations among men and women. Her revolutionary ideas bypass the need to rely on legal systems. It allows all women, no matter the location, ethnicity, race, socioeconomic status, etc., to ally together to form a sisterhood of protective power. She calls it the Sisterhood Constitution or female-to-female alliances. And I'm just going to read a portion of it. The Constitution allows women to create equality amongst females rather than juxtaposed against equality to men. This Constitution contains positive rights focused on initiatives to do or to receive rather than focused on negative rights outlawing behaviors. They are centered on values of sisterhood, resource sharing, protection, and mutual commitment to thriving, equality, and bridge building. That we as women will stand together unified to protect one another, to thwart and ward off patriarchal and gender violence. With that said, prominent male leaders can assist in promoting female-to-female alliances to enable females to receive the aid and help they need and deserve by actively supporting the women in such alliances. So now I want to turn to why male-to-male alliances harm females. The first example provided is regarding the collusion of police officers. Quote, 40% of police officers have been involved in abusing their own intimate partners, suggesting that police officers might be inclined to empathize with, rationalize, or ignore the severity of a batterer's actions, end quote. This is termed male protection racket, a phenomenon in which females learn to rely on males for protection from other males. Because of the prevalence of male sexual violence, women learn to seek male protectors as the first line of defense. Such learned dependence might blind women from recognizing their own collective power in defending against male aggression. Similar to police officers, James N. Poling shared the story of King David and his son Ammon, and Ammon's half-sister Tamar. Ammon manipulated his father to gain access to Tamar and rape her. When David heard what had happened, he was angry. Yet, he took no action against his firstborn son. David colluded with Ammon through his silence. Perhaps he did not want a repetition of his painful encounter with Nathan after he abused Bathsheba, so his own interest prevailed over his compassion for his daughter, and he withdrew into silence, leaving Tamar without any court of justice. Even though men see and hear injustices done against women, they may avoid getting involved in confronting injustice. Silence shares complicity in acts of sexual violence. These acts of collusion are devastating to female victims. So how can male allies help women? The following recommendations are positioned in the context of the powerful work of Dennis McQuigge and Dr. Said Derek Hill's work, Assistant Director of Prevention of Masculine Engagement at Northwest University. Regarding leadership, change must come from the top in order to energize and influence those at the bottom. Sexual violence is a result of the gender hierarchy that holds male lives to be superior to female ones. We must acknowledge the role of religion in enforcing male dominance and female submissiveness. Prominent religious leaders must take a stand to promote female-to-female alliances and deconstruct patriarchal structures that promote sexual violence. Dr. McQuigge strongly believes that religions are often based on ideological constructions and interpretations based on the writings and workings of men. Dr. McQuigge reinforces that patriarchal structures, composed of all males, position a bias and overwhelming influence over behavioral norms. Most importantly, Dr. McQuigge states that world leaders often take their cues from religious leaders. Dr. McQuigge also recommends that community-level religious leaders play a particular role in the grassroots level wherein old behaviors and paradigms must be shifted with education. In regards to shifting male sexual worldviews, Dr. Said Hill's work is an excellent resource. Predominant cultures socialize males that sexual behavior is acceptable based on patriarchal power, dominance, and conquest, rather than one of love. Teaching males to swim counter to the current flowing of intoxicating, eroticized misogyny of porn and media that affects sexual ideologies and behaviors is a priority. This highly contagious and infectious plague, which we have been losing the battle to, must be approached another way. Dr. Hill's program implements strategies to improve masculine engagement in the prevention of violence centered around healthy masculinity. So these are just a few thoughts regarding male allyship in terms of combating gender-based violence with particular regard to religious organizations.
I'm so grateful for Suzie's contribution to this work, and I appreciate the sentiment she shared around preventing violence by promoting healthy masculinity. As Norwegian sociologist Øystein Gullvåg Holter wrote in his report, What's in It for Men? There is a common misunderstanding that increased gender equality provides benefits and privileges for women at the expense of men's benefits and privileges. But the truth is, when we get women out of boxes, we get men out of boxes too. Holter's research confirms the benefits that men experience when they become allies for women. In countries with increased gender equity, men are less likely to get divorced, men have lower rates of suicide, men are less likely to suffer a violent death, men are less likely to be violent against partners and children, and perhaps most importantly, in countries with increased gender equality, men are happier. This is why we need male allies, to protect women, to create equity, and to enjoy happiness. Our next guest, Sharmin Prince, has worked in nonprofits and mental health for the last 20 years, but she was only introduced to the concept of male allyship within the last few years. Like Suzie, Sharmin is an expert in gender-based violence, or GBV, as you'll hear her call it. Through her nonprofit, Eagles Empowered to Soar, Sharmin does an incredible job of challenging privileged folks like me to think harder about how we can be more intersectional and more intentional in our allyship. Sharmin also references a stat that you might not have heard before about the country of Iceland. For the past 14 years, Iceland has been ranked the most gender-equal country in the world. If you're curious, the US ranks 43rd. When journalist Joanne Littman visited Iceland to see what gender equality felt like, she had a striking realization. She said, the reason Iceland ranks number 1 for gender equality doesn't have much to do with the women at all. It's all about the men. The men are just as frustrated with the inequality as their wives and daughters. The men listen to and believe women's stories. The men don't wince at phrases like pay gap, parental leave, or me too. The men and women of Iceland are in this struggle together. If we want to be ranked among the most gender equal countries in the world and to eradicate gender-based violence in our workplaces, homes, and communities, we need men and women to work together. I asked Sharmin to break down what she has seen allies do to make a difference.
For male allyship, it's something that I have been introduced to in the last 2 years. I think it was 2020 when one of our partners invited the founder of Men on Fire in Canada. And he took it on himself. During the 16 days of activism, we had candid conversations. And he asked all the women present for forgiveness. Forgiveness for what men did to them. And when he said that there, everyone teared up. But I said to him that I took that from a white male who is telling me, who's standing in the gap, to say, I am sorry for what men did to you. I took it as I am standing in the gap for my ancestors. And he is apologizing for everything that was done to them, not just to me. And I think that was my introduction to male allyship. After that, I began a man's perspective every year where I'll invite men to join the table to discuss their perspective on gender equality and most of all on gender-based violence. And I've heard the perspective of men from South America. I've heard the perspective of men from the continent this year, Sierra Leone, South Africa, Haiti. So after my introduction in such an impactful and profound way, I took it as something that I need to expand on. And that's what I've experienced for male allyship.
I think that's really powerful. And what a cool, humble example of someone was willing to come in and own up to the mistakes, like you said, of ancestors. I think that's really hard to do because we kind of get stuck in our own selves. So I love that example. Maybe if I could ask a little bit more around your area of expertise, which is gender-based violence, what has the role of men been, and what is it that men could change to really make improvements in gender equity?
For gender-based violence, I believe that men can participate in programs that teach our boys how to treat women and introduce our boys how to break the gender stereotypes. Because I believe that our problems with inequality and GBV, it's because of how we are raising our boys and girls.
Mm.
I like the direction that Iceland is going because of how they raise their boys, how they socialize the boys and the girls. And I believe that if in primary socialization, even if it's not in primary socialization, how Iceland is raising the boys in secondary socialization, it's a no-brainer that when they return home, they will not continue the things that they've learned in school. So I believe that if we can raise our boys that way, we can meet the UN expectation that we will end GBV by 2030, because
Mm.
by that time, those boys will be young adults and we can change the trajectory of gender inequality and gender-based violence.
Oh, I love that so much. And I think as a mom of a son, I'm very conscious of the things that I'm teaching him in my parenting and how I want him to grow up being 3 times the person that I am. I want him to be more inclusive, more respectful of women, and I also want him to be free to be himself. He's a very effervescent little dude, and I want him to feel safe to be himself too, and sometimes the expectations we put on boys lock them in a little box of what masculinity or what manhood is.
Yeah. And thus we have the problem of manliness and all the, we call it toxic masculinity, but there are other aspects of that. So I remember you saying you're raising three feminists, and when you said you're raising a son, and I admire that, because it's breaking the stereotypes, it's against the societal norms and the gender norms. And I can't wait to see what the next decade and 2 decades, what will become of him. Because I know he'll be making an impact into the world of gender equality.
Oh, thank you. I hope so. I love my bright little boy. You had mentioned around the socialization of boys and how that can totally make an impact for that next generation of young adults. Is there maybe one thing that you think would be most impactful to teach those boys in their socialization to make improvements?
To embrace their emotional side. Oftentimes, we tell boys, and I was socialized by a woman of African descent in South America. So the culture is to always tell our boys don't cry. And what we do to our boys is to tell them to suppress their emotions and how they feel.
Mm.
So they are not in touch with that aspect, which is of extreme importance to any human being, because boys and girls have the same emotions, the same psychological makeup. And I think if we can change that, and we can change that approach, or not even just change it, eliminate it from parenting, and men can step in, because sometimes it takes a community to raise a child or the village to raise a child. And men can if there are no father programs or father mentorship programs in their community, they can introduce it even in the schools, because boys are being raised by single parents for a number of reasons. And if even if they can't do it in their community, they can do it within their families and be that male role model and be that male support and example to boys. And I think our world, we can create a utopia.
Sharmin, I'd like to borrow a phrase from you and say, I give you your flowers. Thank you for believing in utopia. In previous conversations, Sharmin has helped me recognize what women like me can do better. When I asked her this time if there was any additional advice she would give, I was very humbled by her response. Anything that you would want to share and that would be really impactful for somebody like me who is trying to do better, any advice you would give?
Well, I enjoyed our last conversation because you were so candid and willing to be bold enough and courageous enough to identify with your privilege and what your privilege has provided. And I believe that if you continue on in that area, I know what it did for me.
Mm.
And just as the impact that introduced me to male allyship, having a more in-depth discussion with you, and you were like the third white person to own their privilege, but you went a little further and you were the first American for me to hear that from. And most of my experience of racism was in the US. So when you shared that with me, it brought healing for me. So thank you for that. And I believe that if you continue on that string, you'll bring a lot of healing to Black women. That, and I believe when you heal or you help a Black woman to heal, you're helping an entire community.
Despite the heavy nature of today's topic, both Suzie and Sharmin believe that healing is possible. That's why allies like you and I have to get to work. Because when you heal one woman, you can help an entire community. At the end of each episode, I share an allyship microaction with you, something you can start doing right away. Today's allyship action: avoid violent language. The issues of gender-based violence cannot be resolved in a day, but we can be conscious of the way our language and our beliefs may be impacting situations like this. Anna Taylor, a communications director, wrote a guide called Evolving from Violent Language. In the historically male-dominated corporate space, aggressive jargon is commonplace. You're killing that. Why don't we kick that idea around? You dodged a bullet there. We need to pull the trigger on this one. We can remove violent language and opt for clarity and kindness instead. Here are a few examples. Instead of saying, I'll take a stab at it, you could say, I'll take the first pass. Instead of saying, you're killing it, you could say, you're doing extremely well. Instead of saying, let's pull the trigger, you could say, let's go live. Being conscious of and removing violent language from our vernacular helps us to create safer spaces for survivors, who are often women. This might not seem like a big deal to you, but like Suzie shared, it's hard to understand the negative effects of gender-based violence unless you've experienced them personally. David Foster Wallace famously said that everything in our immediate experience supports the deep belief that we are the center of the universe. So while it's a good thing that you haven't been impacted by gender-based violence, that doesn't mean that there aren't folks in your workplace who have, and who might be triggered by insensitive language. One thing we can do to get out of our own reality and understand what others are going through is to stress test our own beliefs. We'll talk more about this in the next episode, but I'll give you a few questions to chew on in the meantime. Megan Phelps Roper, writer and activist who famously left the Westboro Baptist Church after campaigning with them for years, suggests that you ask yourself these 3 questions to get curious about your beliefs. First, can you articulate the evidence that you would need to cede your position, or is your perspective unfalsifiable? Second, are you attacking ideas, or are you attacking the people who hold them? Third, are you willing to use extraordinary means, including violence or threats of violence, against people who disagree with you? These are challenging questions, but as we reflect on them honestly, we will help to create more peaceful communities where gender parity is achieved. Thanks for doing the hard work with me today. Next time.
Continually hold your theology up to the light and regularly consider whether it represents this God of love.
If men can actually start to get in touch with their own archetypal feminine, it doesn't emasculate them whatsoever.
Learn more, do better.